What if everything you were taught about the ancient Israelites was pointing to the wrong people? Not because of faith, not because of religion, but because of history, because of DNA, because of maps that are hundreds of years old. Right now, the word Jewish is used to describe one of the most studied groups of people in human history. But here is the question almost nobody is asking. What does that word actually mean? Where did it come from? And more importantly, does the DNA match the story? Because here is what the science says. 40% of all Ashkenazi Jewish people alive today, that's roughly 10 million human beings, trace their entire maternal lineage back to just 4 women, 4 founding mothers. And those 4 women were not from the Middle East. Their DNA markers place them firmly in Europe, not in ancient Canaan, not along the Jordan River, in Europe. Now stop for a second and think about what that means, because in traditional Torah law, Jewish identity passes through the mother. The mother is everything. So if the 4 founding mothers of the largest Jewish population on earth were European women, what does that tell us about who is actually descended from the ancient tribes of Israel? This is not a political statement. This is not an attack on anyone's faith. This is a question that historians, geneticists, and archaeologists have been quietly debating for decades. And today, we are going to follow that question wherever it leads, because the evidence leads somewhere very surprising. It leads to a forgotten empire that rose and fell in the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It leads to a king who made one of the most extraordinary political decisions in all of medieval history. And it leads, through slave ships, ancient maps, and DNA laboratories, to the coast of West Africa. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see a very different map of ancient history than the one you grew up with. Let us start with a word, because this whole story begins with a translation error that most people have never noticed. The original Hebrew word is Yehudi. Say it out loud, Yehudi. In ancient Hebrew, this word has a very specific meaning. It refers to someone from the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 tribes of ancient Israel. And the name Judah itself comes from a Hebrew root word meaning praise of Yah, a reference to the divine name. So Yehudi was a tribal designation, a bloodline identifier. It meant you were descended from a specific group of people in a specific region of the ancient Near East. Now, somewhere in the process of translation, moving from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to Old English, something happened to that word. It became Jew. And then, even more strangely, it became Jewish, with an ish at the end. And here's where it gets linguistically interesting. The suffix ish in the English language has a very particular function. Think about how we use it. Boyish does not mean the same thing as boy. Greenish does not mean the same thing as green. Reddish means sort of red, kind of red, approximately red. Foolish means having qualities associated with a fool, but it does not mean you are one. So what exactly does Jewish mean? According to the rules of the English language, it means approximately like a Jew, in the general direction of Judah, sort of related to the original concept, but not quite the same thing. Now, most scholars would say this is an innocent quirk of translation, and maybe it is, but it raises a question worth asking. Why did that particular suffix stick? And does it matter? I want you to hold that question in your mind as we move forward, because the linguistic shift is just the surface layer. Underneath it, there's a much bigger story, and that story takes us to a place most Americans have never heard of. The year is 740 A.D. The place is a vast territory stretching from the northern shores of the Caspian Sea all the way west to the Crimean Peninsula. This region, sitting between what is today Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine, was home to one of the most powerful empires in the medieval world. They were called the Khazars. The Khazar Empire was a Turkic state. Their people were not Arab, not Semitic, not descended from the ancient tribes of Canaan. They were a steppe people, warriors and traders who had built an incredible commercial civilization at the crossroads between the Christian Byzantine Empire to the west and the expanding Islamic Caliphate to the south and east. And that geographical position created a serious political problem. The Byzantine emperor wanted the Khazars to convert to Christianity. The Islamic Caliph wanted them to convert to Islam. Both empires were aggressively expanding. Both saw the Khazar Empire as a prize or a buffer zone, and both wanted the Khazars on their side of the religious divide. And King Bulan had to make a decision that would define the future of his people. Here is what the historical record shows, and this is documented in multiple medieval sources, including correspondence that still exists today between Khazar royalty and the Jewish community in Spain. King Bulan chose a third option. He converted himself and his entire ruling class to Judaism, not because of a divine vision, not because he had read the Torah and been spiritually moved, though that may have played a role, but largely because Judaism gave him a political escape hatch. By adopting a religion that was not aligned with either Constantinople or Baghdad, he could maintain neutrality. He could trade with both sides. He could be the independent power in the middle. It was, in many ways, one of the most brilliant political moves of the medieval era. But here is the consequence that echoes through history. Over the next century or two, Judaism spread from the royal court outward to the general Khazar population. A Turkic steppe people with no ancestral connection to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob began to practice the religion, the customs, and eventually to use the identity of ancient Israel. Now I want you to pause here and just think about that. Millions of people adopting an identity not through ancestry, but through conversion and cultural assimilation. What are the long-term effects of something like that? Here is what is interesting. Most mainstream historians acknowledge the Khazar conversion happened. This is not fringe history. It is documented in Jewish encyclopedias, in medieval chronicles, in Arabic historical texts, and in surviving Khazar correspondence. The debate among scholars is about the scale. How many Khazars converted, and how much did that conversion contribute to the later Ashkenazi Jewish population of Eastern Europe? And that brings us back to the DNA. Let me tell you about a study that shook the academic world when it was published. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Dr. Eran El-Haik at Johns Hopkins University published a paper in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution. The paper examined the genetic origins of Ashkenazi Jewish populations, and what they found was striking. The study concluded that Ashkenazi Jews show the strongest genetic similarity to populations from the Caucasus region, the area historically associated with the Khazar Empire, rather than to populations from the ancient Levant, which is modern-day Israel and Palestine. Now, this study was immediately controversial. Other geneticists pushed back. The mainstream position, supported by a different set of studies, is that Ashkenazi Jews do show meaningful genetic connections to Middle Eastern populations, while also showing European admixture. The debate is ongoing and genuinely complex, but here is what virtually all studies agree on. That 40% figure about the 4 founding mothers is real. It comes from a 2006 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child, researchers traced the maternal lineage of Ashkenazi Jews and found that 40% descend from just 4 women, and those 4 women's genetic signatures match European lineages, not Middle Eastern ones. What does this mean? Scholars have different interpretations. Some say these 4 women were European converts who married into already established Jewish communities. Some say it reflects centuries of European admixture after the initial Levantine population arrived in Europe. And some, including researchers who follow the Khazar hypothesis, argue it reflects a founding population that was never from the ancient Near East in the first place. The point is not to tell you which interpretation is correct. The point is to show you that the question of genetic origin is genuinely open. And it matters, not for religious reasons, but for historical ones. And here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because while we have been focused on who might have adopted the identity of ancient Israel, there is an entirely separate body of evidence suggesting that the descendants of the actual ancient Israelites might still be here, just in a place nobody expected to look. I want to stop here for a second and ask you something directly. Before you heard about the Khazar Empire, before you saw any of this DNA evidence, what was your mental image of where the ancient Israelites ended up? Drop your answer in the comments, because I think most of us were taught a very specific story, and this video is asking us to examine whether that story is complete. We need to talk about a tribe in southern Africa, and then we need to talk about a people in Nigeria, and then we need to look at a map from 1747. Let us start in Zimbabwe. The Lemba people are a Bantu-speaking group living in Zimbabwe and South Africa. For generations, they maintained an oral tradition that was largely dismissed by outsiders. They claimed to be descendants of ancient Israelites, specifically of priests from Jerusalem who fled south through Africa centuries ago. They kept strict dietary laws reminiscent of Leviticus. They practiced male circumcision. They observed a day of rest. They had a sacred object they called the Noma Lungundu, which their oral tradition described in ways eerily similar to descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists filed this under interesting but unverifiable folklore. Then came the DNA. In 1999, a landmark study was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Researchers examined the Y chromosome markers of the Lemba men, and specifically, they looked for something called the Cohen modal haplotype. Here is what the Cohen modal haplotype is. It is a specific pattern of Y chromosome markers found at unusually high rates among men who identify as Kohanim, the priestly class descended from Aaron, brother of Moses. Because the Cohen designation passes from father to son along with the Y chromosome, geneticists have been able to track this marker across populations. Among self-identified Jewish Kohanim, the Cohen modal haplotype appears in roughly 50% of men. Among the Lemba, the same marker appeared at similar or even higher rates, specifically in the Buba clan, which the Lemba tradition identifies as their founding priestly lineage. Think about that for a moment. A group of people in southern Africa with no contact with modern Jewish communities carrying a genetic marker that is used as evidence of ancient Levitical priestly lineage. This was not a small sample. This was not a statistical fluke. This finding has been replicated and discussed in peer-reviewed journals. It is one of the most remarkable intersections of oral history and genetic science in modern research. Now let us move north to Nigeria. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria are one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa, and for centuries they have maintained a set of cultural practices that bear remarkable similarity to the laws recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Not vague similarities, specific ones. The Igbo practice circumcision on the 8th day after birth. This is not a common cultural practice across Africa. It is a very specific detail, and it matches Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3 exactly. The Igbo observe dietary restrictions that parallel the kosher laws of Leviticus. They have a seventh-day rest tradition that resembles the Sabbath as described in Deuteronomy. They have naming ceremonies, mourning rituals, and purity customs that align with details in the Pentateuch. Now, critics of this connection would say these could be coincidences. They could be the result of Christian missionary influence. They could be cultural parallels that developed independently. Those are fair points to raise, and they are debated by scholars. But here is what makes the Igbo case harder to dismiss as simple missionary influence. Many of these practices were documented by European explorers and missionaries in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the missionaries themselves noted with surprise that the Igbo already observed practices that matched the Old Testament before Christianity arrived. Here is a question I genuinely want you to think about, and leave your answer below. If we found a community in, say, Japan or Brazil that carried the Cohen modal haplotype and practiced eighth-day circumcision and Sabbath observance, would we take their historical claims seriously? Or does geography change how we evaluate evidence? Because I think that question reveals something important about how we've been taught to see African history. Now I want to show you something, a piece of cartographic evidence that does not get talked about in mainstream history classes. In 1747, a French cartographer named Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville produced a highly detailed map of West Africa. This was not a casual sketch. D'Anville was one of the most respected geographers of the 18th century. His maps were used by European governments and trading companies. They were considered authoritative. On that map, along the coast of what is today the Republic of Benin, in the region between modern Nigeria and Ghana, there is a label. The map reads Judah, or in some versions, Uda, and in certain editions the territory is labeled with language that translates to Kingdom of Judah. This is not a metaphor. This is not a religious naming by Christian missionaries. This is an 18th century cartographer labeling a geographic and political territory on the West African coast with a name that comes directly from the Hebrew tribe of Judah. Now, the city of Uda exists there today. It is in the modern nation of Benin, and Uda has another distinction in history. It was one of the major ports through which enslaved Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean during the transatlantic slave trade. And here is where the history becomes both profound and painful. The Yoruba people, who inhabit much of this coastal West African region, use a word for this territory that sounds remarkably similar to the Hebrew tribal name. The linguistic connection has been noted by several researchers studying the etymology of West African place names. Now, I want to be careful here. Etymology can be misleading. Similar-sounding names can be coincidences. Professional historians rightly caution against over-interpreting phonetic similarities. But when you combine the map evidence with the DNA evidence from the Lemba, with the cultural practice evidence from the Igbo, with the oral traditions maintained across multiple West African communities, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to explain away with coincidence alone. What some researchers have proposed, and this is a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion, is that a significant portion of the ancient Israelite diaspora moved not west through Rome and Europe, but south and then west through the African continent. That over centuries and millennia, descendants of ancient Hebrew tribes became integrated into African populations while maintaining remnants of their ancestral practices, and that when the transatlantic slave trade began, a portion of those descendants were among the millions taken across the ocean to the Americas and the Caribbean. So let us bring these two threads together, because what we are really looking at is a story about a name, the name Israel, and two very different groups of people who have some claim to connection with that name. On one side, a Turkic people from the Caucasus, who in the 8th century converted to Judaism for political reasons, who then, as their empire collapsed over the following centuries under pressure from Mongol invasions and the expansion of Kievan Rus, dispersed westward into Eastern Europe, who became the Ashkenazi Jewish population of Poland, Lithuania, Germany, and Russia, who carried Jewish culture, Jewish law, Jewish learning, and Jewish identity through centuries of persecution, through the Holocaust, and ultimately into the modern state of Israel. Their contribution to Jewish intellectual and cultural life is extraordinary. The Ashkenazi tradition produced some of the greatest philosophers, scientists, musicians, and legal scholars in recorded history. That cannot and should not be minimized. On the other side, sub-Saharan African populations who carry genetic markers, specifically the Cohen modal haplotype, that are used by mainstream genetics as evidence of ancient Levitical priestly descent, who practice customs documented before significant Christian influence that mirror Mosaic law with striking precision, who are recorded on 18th century maps in territories labeled with the name of the ancient tribe of Judah, and whose oral traditions, stretching back centuries, claim descent from the original Hebrew tribes. These two stories do not have to be in conflict. History is complicated, identity is layered. People move, people mix, traditions travel and transform across time and geography. But what is undeniable is this: the question of who the ancient Israelites were, where they went, and who their descendants are today, that question is far more complex, far more contested, and far more interesting than most of us were ever taught. I want to hear from you right now. Seriously, this is the kind of topic where different perspectives genuinely matter. If you had never heard of the Khazar Empire before this video, tell me in the comments. And if you are from West Africa or from a community that has its own oral tradition connecting to ancient Hebrew history, I especially want to hear from you, because this channel is about recovering history that has been overlooked, and that recovery depends on the people who carry it. You might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter? These are ancient events. These are questions about identity and ancestry that happened thousands of years ago. What does it change? Here is why I think it matters.
First, it matters for intellectual honesty. We live in an era where genetic science and archaeological research are genuinely changing our understanding of ancient history. The human genome is, in many ways, the most accurate historical document we have. When that document conflicts with the received narrative, we should be willing to ask questions, not to tear down, but to understand more completely. Second, it matters for the African communities that carry these traditions. The Lemba people spent generations having their oral history dismissed as fantasy. Then genetics proved that something real had been preserved in that tradition for centuries. That is an extraordinary validation, and it raises the question, what other African oral traditions are we too quick to dismiss? Third, it matters because the story of ancient Israel, the Exodus, the Covenant, the Law, the Diaspora, is one of the most influential historical narratives in human civilization. It has shaped 3 major world religions. It has shaped political philosophy, legal systems, and cultural identity across continents. Understanding where the people in that story actually came from and where they actually went is not a minor footnote. It is a central chapter in the human story. And finally, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable point, it matters because the transatlantic slave trade specifically targeted the West African coast, the same coast where 18th century maps labeled a kingdom with the name of an ancient Hebrew tribe. That map exists. None of this proves a single, simple, alternative history, but all of it together asks us to do something important, to hold our inherited narratives loosely enough to let the evidence breathe, because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is more interesting, more human, and more connected than any single group's version of history. And that, perhaps, is the most important thing history can teach us. If this video made you think about something differently today, please share it. These are the kinds of conversations that need to be had in public, not just in academic journals. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you already knew, what surprised you, and what you want to learn more about. This topic goes so much deeper: the archaeology of ancient Judah, the genetic studies on Yemenite Jews, the Falasha of Ethiopia, the crypto-Jews of North Africa. There is an entire series of videos waiting to be made. If you want to see more historical deep dives like this one, subscribe and hit the bell. New content drops every week. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do with history is refuse to stop asking questions.